Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we deepen our exploration of the UFO, UAP phenomenon and look at how people are actually investigating these incidences in a very scientific, investigatory way. I want to begin, however, by just pausing about what's happening in Gaza. And it's hard for me to even speak about what's going on because of the horrific nature of events over there. But it's coming now to, I think, a climax in the following way. We've been witnessing for 6 months an attempt by the Israelis to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. And 2.3 million Palestinians have been displaced. And the world has been watching and putting increasing pressure on the Israelis to stop the genocide and to have a ceasefire. The United States 3 times vetoed a ceasefire resolution in the UN Security Council, and then just yesterday finally succumbed and abstained, as literally the entire world now is condemning Israel for genocide and demanding a ceasefire, as Israel has done on repeated occasions in the past. They're not only ignoring the UN Security Council resolution, which they're legally bound to adhere to, they are now doubling down. Benjamin Netanyahu has canceled a trip to Washington. Israel has withdrawn its negotiators from Qatar. And the Israelis are now explicitly, publicly engaging in mass starvation by refusing to allow the United Nations Refugee Agency, which has been the essential instrument for the distribution of humanitarian aid, to any longer operate in Gaza. So we're in a situation where, because of the Israeli blockade, 500 trucks a day are necessary for minimal life support. That has essentially been now completely cut off. And so we're at this moment where the world is coalescing to tell Israel to stop, including the United States now. Although it's very important to remember that the United States continues to support Israel with ongoing military aid. And rather than acknowledge what it's doing and beginning any meaningful negotiations or a ceasefire or allowing food for the starving Palestinians, it's doubling down. So what will now unfold is a test of wills between a country that is committing genocide and is now trying to starve 2.3 million Palestinians, including mothers and children. There's about 18 to 20 mothers that give birth every day in Gaza. And the Israelis' refusal to stop. So we're in a moment, everyone, where human civility is going to be tested in unprecedented ways. And I've stumbled a little bit on my words today because I'm not quite sure what to say. I feel more deeply than I can communicate, particularly having been here in California and held my little grandson who's being just surrounded and almost smothered in love. And I can't get the Palestinian mothers and babies out of my mind. We're still working on a way to get them resources. It's not quite figured out yet, but I'll be announcing that over the next couple of days, hopefully. But sometimes it's just simply the act of bearing witness, simply the act of opening one's heart to the suffering of others that makes us more fully human. Even if we can't really do anything practically, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, we can just beam into Palestine and in ways that we can't understand. Somehow, an open heart strengthens a suffering heart, even at a vast difference of time zones. So let us just hold the children of Palestine as they starve. I'd like to now turn our attention to our subject today. And I know it's hard to make these transitions, but transition we must to this huge issue that is now enveloping humanity as the entire human race takes in the gravity of our extraterrestrial presence on our planet. And we're very privileged today to have with us Gary Heseltine from Great Britain, who I've gotten to know recently, and he's a remarkable man. All the people I've met in this journey around UAP disclosure, Gary is one of the most remarkable because most of the people that we talk with, as you know, have these deep experiences and they speak very powerfully from their experience. And there's people like Richard Dolan who are historians, and Danny Sheehan, who's a constitutional litigator, and others that do a lot of work in this domain. Gary Heseltine is a policeman. And for many, many years, he worked for the Royal Air Force Police. Then he was a police officer in the British Transport Service. He was a certified detective and he investigated crimes, murders and thefts and all kinds of things. And then he began to apply his considerable talents and skill in investigation, scientific investigation. Think Sherlock Holmes to the UFO phenomenon. And in 2002, set up this national database for UFO investigations coming from the police that were operating around Great Britain. He's written a book on UFO and pilots, and he recently is now vice president of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, ICER, who we'll be hearing from along the way much more frequently. They're at the cutting edge of extraterrestrial research, and they're applying scientific rigor to this phenomenon. So we're very pleased to have Gary with us today. He will make a presentation. Gary, if you want to turn on your video and unmute yourself, would love to just welcome you to Humanity Rising. And Gary will just tell us a little bit about his personal background and his journey, as a police officer and coming into the UFO domain. And then he and I will dialogue for a bit, and then we'll adjourn to the after chat where he will be present for those of you who want a more intimate conversation with him where everybody can see each other on a Zoom meeting. So, Gary, thank you. And why don't we begin with just telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into this domain and the uh, detective work that you've been doing on UFO sightings there in Great Britain and the work that you've been doing with ICER.
If you don't mind, but just before I do that, I was moved by your words on the Palestinian crisis.
Mm,
I've not spoken publicly on it, although part of me has wanted to, but I would just say that your words were very well put. And whilst there is no excuse for what happened on October the 7th, that's a war crime. Two wrongs don't make a right. And everything that I've followed in real time with the what it can only be described as a genocidal attack on the Palestinian people. Uh, you put it beautifully, and I think what's happening now is the brink of an absolute calamity on all fronts, and the fact that my country is complicit by
mm,
offering total support, and America is complicit by offering arms and money to the Israelis. It's double standard, and I really fear for the humanitarian crisis that's developing, which is on a scale that I've never seen in my life.
mm, mm. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so back to the question, back to the real stuff, as it were. Okay, I had a sighting of a strange bright white light when I was 16 years old. I had, prior to that, no interest whatsoever in UFOs. And then I was walking my then girlfriend home um, in Scunthorpe in Lincolnshire, which is my hometown. And at the time, we were walking along a very narrow footpath that divided my, what you would say, high school fields on my left as we were walking. And on the right side, in England, we call it allotments, which is basically where people grow vegetables in public areas where there might be 50, 100 little minor little sites where people grow stuff. So that's called an allotment. So as we're walking along this footpath, in the distance, and by the way, there was no lighting on the footpath at all. In the distance, there was houses, a housing estate at the end of this very long alleyway that was approximately 300, 400 meters long. And as we uh, were walking towards the end and perhaps at the darkest point, we suddenly noticed a bright white light moving at, say, 60-degree angle from our right to left. So if you can imagine a long straight path ahead, two of us literally side by side. I had my bicycle with me, and we're walking along. We see this bright white light. It was indistinct shape. It wasn't a flying saucer. It wasn't a cigar. No distinct shape, but it was much bigger than the background stars. And we couldn't hear anything. And it seemed to be gliding or moving very slowly and silently from our right to left. And now, the strange thing was that as soon as the object went beyond our um, perspective, say if you think of the 90 degrees, as soon as the object went past, the whole area behind the object's flight path was plunged into a total power cut. And it obviously got very dark. And so at that time, rightly or wrongly, my then girlfriend got a bit anxious, not knowing what it was or whether the light had had any influence. And so we stopped and watched, and the object then carried on moving very, very slowly, silently, appeared silent. And then another power cut behind the area of its flight path. Now, at that point there, I was just intrigued. And because I'd got my bicycle with me, I thought, I reckon I can try to catch this up. And it was moving in the general direction of where I lived. So another reason to try to chase it on my bicycle. So I said to my girlfriend, get on the crossbar, as you do in England, get on the crossbar, two of us on the bike to the end of the alleyway, turned right, dropped her off at her house, which is approximately 200 meters from the end of the alleyway. The houses and the area is in total darkness. I then get on my bike and I race like mad back to the same alleyway. I then go along the alleyway, racing like mad. I then come out, turn right onto what's called a road called Grange Lane South, and I'm absolutely pedaling like mad. And don't forget, the entire area where I'm pedaling is in complete power cut. Everything is off. Every bit of power is off. And this Strange Lane South is a long straight road that goes towards where I lived as a child. And it was approximately, I don't know, half a mile, three-quarters of a mile long. And so I'm racing, racing. And then I realized that near to a bend in the distance, the power was on because all the light, it was such a distinction from darkness to light. And so as I get to this left-hand bend near to my home, I go from darkness into the light, and then at that point there, I don't know why, but I look over my right shoulder, and literally, I just managed to get ahead of the light. So I've now literally just got ahead of this light. It's moving still very slowly and silently in the direction of where I lived. And so I go around two corners, turn right onto Westerdale Road, and then right onto Baysdale Road, which was where I lived. And I lived at number 3, so it was very close to the junction. Drop my bike outside. I go rushing in to my parents who are in England. We have supper, which is a cup of tea, as British people do. And I say, come outside. I think there's going to be a power cut caused by this strange light. And literally, they don't get up. They just look at me bemused. So I run through the hall, run through the kitchen, out the back door, into the back garden, go to the bottom of my garden, which was maybe 40 meters long, turned around and looked back at my semi-detached house, just in time to see the object coming over my rooftop. How bizarre is that, coming over my rooftop? Now, I'm at the bottom of the garden, and I still don't know why I do it to this day, but I put my hand up like I'm answering a question in class. And I think what I was trying to do is make this 90-degree angle. And as soon as the object went beyond the 90 degrees, whole area plunged into darkness. Now, I'm not psychic. I can't predict power cuts. So I realized then, as a 16-year-old, that that light, whatever it was, having moved perhaps three-quarters of a mile to a second geographical position, had interacted with a power grid. And that's what started all of this journey into ufology. Are you there? Who's gone? Right, so I'll carry on. Okay, so after that, the only thing that I could do in 1976 was literally go to a second-hand bookshop. In England, it was just before the start of what was the video cassette era, VHS and Betamax videos. And so the only thing that I could literally do was go to the second-hand bookshop. And I went to a second-hand bookshop in a place called Ashby, which is a suburb of Scunthorpe, and it had lots of shops. So I went there, and there was a bookshop that I knew, I'd often been in before. And I went in and I basically looked for books on UFOs. And the really strange thing was, and when I look back at it now, I think there's lots of coincidences and synchronicities that I didn't realize at the time was the very first book that I got was by Major Donald Kehoe. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but it was the last of Major Donald Kehoe's books, Aliens from Space, and it was the fifth, the last of his 5 books. And I got it in the second-hand bookshop. It was effectively new, wrapped in cellophane. And one of the strange things was that in the book, it talked briefly about the New York blackout in 1965 and how the eastern seaboard had been plunged into darkness for about 7 or 8 hours, and people were stuck in tubes, lifts, and etc. etc. And there'd been some belief in that book that it'd been caused by UFOs. So straight away, I kind of got a confirmation of sorts that what I'd seen was UFO related. And the other major thing that came from getting that book is you think about all the probably thousands of books that had been written by then, 1976, on UFOs. And yet the very first book that I get is by someone that turns out to be my absolute hero in the subject of trying to get to the truth and get the public to realize what's going on, along with James McDonald, Major Null Kehoe. So, you know, of all the books that you could have bought, I bought one that has stood the test of time, and he is a pioneer. And I think there's a new book that's out that I'm keen to get, which is a biography of Donald Kehoe. So a major important figure who who's spent pretty much all his later life trying to get the truth out, as it were, about the ET or non-human reality. He would have said ET at that time because it was flying saucers, the term of the day. But so that was my interest. I read that avidly, and I couldn't believe that there were stories of pilots chasing UFOs, because what I did really know, or had I guess realised from the news up to being 16, was that it was a stigmatised subject, and that, you know, people who believed in UFOs and aliens were crazy people. Oh, that's what they said. And so one of the real things that impressed me was all these military cases that Donald Kehoe kept referring to, that he said had been given by people involved in Project Blue Book, etc. And I was incredibly drawn towards pilot encounters, which are still my favourite class of UFO case, because if a pilot really doesn't know what he's looking at, especially if there's a lot of detail, close proximity, duration, multiple witnesses, multiple radar confirmation, etc. You know, if they don't know what they're looking at, there's something really wrong. And especially that applies to military pilots who, if you think about it, you know, their life depends on quick recognition of, is it friend or foe in a wartime environment, or an action area. And so when I read in Keogh's book about pilots chasing, I immediately realized that these things were real. You know, and then you start going down the rabbit hole of wondering why the rest of the world doesn't realize that they're real. And, you know, when you see credible witnesses, etc., from all walks of life, radar operators, police officers, military personnel, air traffic controllers, sonar operators, astronauts, cosmonauts, all those kind of people, you know, they're pretty good witnesses. And so that's really where my story begins. But it then goes off on a kind of a tangent, because I literally, the only other thing that I did after the sighting was join BUFORA, which was the British UFO Research Association, which was the big organisation of the day, kind of comparable country-wise to MUFON, Mutual UFO Network in the States. So I joined that as an associate member. But, you know, I remember going to one UFO meeting at someone's house, just local people, half a dozen people there, and I thought these people were a bit crazy, some of them. So basically, I only went once, and that didn't impress me. So basically, that's all I did. I started to collect UFO books, like a lot of people do after a first experience. I started to look up in the sky more, which again, I think is something that happens to a lot of people. And literally, I then went away and had a life. I got married. I joined the Air Force between 1983 and 1989. And other than reading the odd book and seeing something on TV, I really didn't do anything for about the next 18 years. And I kind of look back at my life now and think that, you know, when I really started to come back into the subject and realized that I wanted to do something researcher wise and get actively involved as an investigator, that didn't happen until really in my late 30s. So that's a big gap from having a sighting at 16. But a strange thing happened again. 1995-ish, I was in a big bookstore, and then I suddenly came across a magazine called UFO Magazine, which was a British publication. Quest Publications printed it, and the editor was a guy called Graham Birdsall, who I didn't know. But quickly I started to get this magazine. Originally, when I got it, it was bi-monthly, and then it went to monthly, and it was really on an upward trajectory. And the strange thing was that that kind of reawakened my interest. And basically, I started to collect the magazines. And in the intervening years, there'd been a lot of books that I wasn't aware of that had been printed. And there was like a new breed of researcher, people in the UK like Nick Redfern and other people, Tim Good's books in particular, Above Top Secret, Beyond Top Secret, those kind of books were, I just started to collect them again. And I guess that happened over 2 or 3 years of my reinvestigating, not reinvestigating, but reawakening of what had been going on in the UFO world in the kind of intervening years where I'd only had a passing interest. And one of the strange things that happened, and I do look back and think that they're all very strange, and I never used to believe in the word synchronicity, and now I do through this subject because there are just far too many strange coincidences. And another one that led me to become like a public researcher was the fact that Quest Publications was printed, and its headquarters was only 11 miles away from where I worked. When you think about the odds of that, that magazine could have been printed in London, Scotland, anywhere, but it was only 11 miles away from where I worked. And I worked in a big city, Leeds, I think the fifth biggest city in the UK. And like, wow, that's only 11 miles away. Maybe I'll have contact with them sometime. But what happened before that was even stranger, was that after, I guess, probably 3.5 years of re-educating myself about what had happened in the intervening years, I went to bed one night, like you do, and most of the time I don't remember dreams whatsoever. But I woke up with a incredibly vivid dream scenario, and the dream scenario was a fictional story about what could cause disclosure with a big D. So we're talking late 1990s. So this is a long time before anybody was talking about big disclosure with a big D. But obviously people work towards that, I guess. But in a very strange way, I woke up and I had a clear idea for the premise of a screenplay, a film screenplay. Well, let me put this into context. The context is that as a child, my passion had always been for the cinema, and my dad used to take me on a Saturday, every Saturday, to the cinema in Scunthorpe. So I developed this passion for films, which I still have. And so that, in many ways, was my first real passion. And when that happened, I was so impressed by the story, I couldn't get it out of my head. And it was the basic premise of characters, a storyline, where the events would take place, which is actually in the States, in Montana. And I ended up choosing real places, real lakes, and things like that. And the strange thing was that I did not have any experience of writing other than essays at school. And I never really tried at school. So, that was nothing to go by. But there I was waking up with such a powerful dream, a fictional set of characters like imprinted in my brain. And I remember saying to my first wife, I've got to write this down. I've got to do something. And what happened was strange because I had no knowledge of how to write a screenplay, formats, things like that. And the only thing that I'd read was Shakespeare at school. And I remember reading the books and the words were in the middle, put the name and then there'd be the speech and it was done in that way, different to a book. It was conversation. And so I then the era of computers was just mass computers in the UK becoming available, and word processors, computer word processors was coming on board. And I remember getting the first computer within weeks and then starting to write in a way that I'd never written anything before. And the crazy thing was, within 6 weeks, I wrote my first screenplay. I've written five now, four of which are feature-length films, and wrote this story, this fictional story, and all I got was the premise, the characters, and where to begin. And like anybody who's ever gone on a writing journey, you don't know whether you can write. But I found that within 6 weeks, I'd found a middle and an end. So I'd had the start, I worked through, found a middle, and found an end to end the story. And what happened after that was, um, you know, instead of, I guess, just keeping it to myself, I decided to print it off on full A5 sheets of paper. I've never done anything like this before. And I used to say to my colleagues, I've written this screenplay. And they'd say, yeah, yeah, yeah. Cynical policemen as they are. And I said, well, do you want to read it? And some of my closest colleagues in the CID department, criminal investigation department, detectives, they said, yeah, all right, I'll have a read. So I would give it to one at a time, and they'd come back a week or so later and say, this is brilliant, Gary. Oh. And then gradually, more and more people in the police station where I worked in Leeds began to get hold of the copy and read it, and they all came back and said, wow, this is a great story, and make a great film. Of course, I had no knowledge of anything to do with film other than loving the genre of film. And maybe 10 or 12 people in the police station where I worked um, read it, and all were absolutely glowing about it. And I thought, oh, that's good. But I needed something more. And of course, these were just ordinary people with no real knowledge of the subject. They just looked at it as an entertaining story. So what I decided to do was um, go back to Graham Birdsall. You remember I said it was only 11 miles away? Well, it's like somebody was tapping me on the shoulder to say, this is meant to be. And it sounds crazy, but that's literally what happened. So having written the first screenplay, I remember one Sunday printing it off, and a new version because the other had got dog-eared, and printing it off, and it was like this really thick, and put it in a big envelope. And I remember driving all the way to his office, which was 11 miles away at the time. I think it was Otley, just outside Leeds. And I remember going to the office. It was closed because it was obviously the weekend. And I remember thinking, no, I'll never hear anything. But I kind of just wanted some kind of validation feedback from somebody who knew the subject. And I basically just posted it through his door. And I kind of thought to myself, oh, well, I'll probably never hear anything. And I didn't for about 6 weeks. And then 6 weeks later, just out in the blue, Graham Birdsall rang me. And I was like quite shocked. And he said, this is brilliant. This will make a great film. and I'll help you in any way I can. And he says, I'll even give you a cover note to send to film companies and things like that, which I still have. And he wrote me a one-page review cover letter, basically to say that he thought it was brilliant, make a great film, blah, blah, blah. Which I've still got. I used to have on my wall. I've moved house several times, so it's not on my wall at the moment, but I still have it. And I think that was dated around 2000, off the top of my head. And so when he did that, he said to me, well, I'm so impressed the fact that you're a police officer and blah, blah, blah. He said, would you like to come to a UFO conference? And again, the irony is weird because for about 22 years, Graham Birdsall held the largest UFO international conference in Leeds. And I worked in Leeds. And I only lived about 15 miles from Leeds in Pontefract at that time. And there he is. His office was only 11 miles from where I worked. I mean, the odds of that are so, I think, astronomical. It beggars belief. So he was in a September. So I think it's probably September 2001, maybe. And he gave me some free tickets and he said, come along for the weekend. And it was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I went to it. I think it was probably 2000. And I went to it and I was just like amazed at some of the speakers. And I think it was when John Mack was there. I think Stanton Friedman was there. I'd have to check, but I seem to remember that. And a strange kind of thing was going on inside of me, which I didn't realize, which was something felt like I was being drawn into the subject, that I wanted to get involved in some kind of active research. And I think that's actually why I had the dream of the screenplay that led to all of this, is because there was this growing sense of frustration that why can't people see how real this is and the very credible people that are having these experiences? And it's like the world's crazy for not taking an interest in what are pilots, military, commercial, radar operators, etc. And I think it was that sense of frustration that conjured up, for want of a better word, that dream of this fictional story that could create disclosure, you know, cause disclosure. And so it was with that story that I then went to Graham Birdsall. I went to his office and met him, and he said, I'm so pleased to meet you, blah, blah, blah. And at that time, it was just talking about the screenplay. But he'd said, come to the conference. I ended up going to the conference, heard all the lectures, I think, over the Saturday and the Sunday, and was just blown away. And again, this sense of frustration was growing inside me to the point where I kept thinking, I want to get involved, but how do I get involved? When you're a detective, and anybody who's been a detective will understand this, is your life's not your own, because basically if some major incident happens, there's a murder, a manslaughter, a rape, something like that, you then work lots of hours. You rarely go home other than to sleep. And the idea is most crimes are solved within a few days if they're going to be solved. And so everybody kind of works long hours. And so I couldn't ever join a UFO group or a club or anything like that, because I couldn't do it on a regular basis. A life as a detective is you can't nail times to a calendar. It's in you go by what happens. And so I think what I began to think was, how can I get involved that works around my schedule as a police officer? And then I kind of had a very second strange dream. Now, obviously, now and again, you do remember your dreams, but most of the time, I don't remember dreams at all. But I then had this very prominent second dream. And the second dream was create a database for police officers. Why police officers? One, I was a police officer, and two, people say write about what you know. So I again went to bed, not realizing I was going to have a dream, woke up with a very vivid idea of creating an unofficial national database for police officers. Now, at the time, I was a detective. I was, I think, 12 years into my career at that point, and I basically went back to Graham Birdsall and said, "Look, I had this idea for an unofficial national database to record and collate police officer accounts, UK police officer accounts." And because I was a serving detective, he was like, "Whoa, I think this is really good. You're a very credible person. You're still serving. It will bring credibility to the subject." And so what I'd gone to him and said was, "Well, if I write an article about my idea, I'd like to launch this website called Prufos, the Prufos Police Database, Prufos being police reporting UFOs." And he liked the idea. I created a website, and I said, "Well, can I write an article in your magazine to launch it, as it were, publicly?" Now, you've got to understand how exciting that was for me, because I'd never written anything, other than, that had been viewed publicly by the masses, as it were. And I think at that time his circulation was something like 30,000-40,000 worldwide in the subject of UFOs. It was very popular in the United States as well as obviously the UK, but it went to, I think, 11 or 12 countries. So when he said, "Yeah, you can write an article," I was like, "Wow, this is amazing." And I was going to write my first magazine article that's going to be in a bona fide magazine that you can get in any top news agent. And so that was a real buzz. And that article was published in January 2002, which marked the launch of Prufos Police Reporting UFOs database. And that's still in existence. And cutting a long story short, within weeks, I was getting mainly retired police officers contacting me and relating their accounts. But what was kind of strange was that the vast majority had often not told their wives and families for fear of ridicule. I then started to get occasional serving police officer cases, and I did what I do now with UK pilots, is offer confidentiality. As long as they could prove who they were to me, I understood that they didn't want to risk their career by going public and saying, "Well, I've had a UFO experience," because of the stigma, the terrible stigma that dogged the subject for well over 70 years, and whilst it's receding, is still there in certain quarters. And so basically, I, was fortunate to get the magazine out there, and straight away police officers contacted me. It wasn't a flood, it never has been a flood, just a steady stream of police officers getting to know that you're out there. The more you become well known in the subject, the more obviously people are going to realize that there is the database there. And suffice to say that now, in 2024, I've got something like 550 British cases going back to 1901, involving well over 1,000, I think 1,100 British police officers, which is a lot. Some have come to me direct, some are historical accounts through old magazines, books and things like that. So it's a collection of all those things. But what it proves is some very, very credible cases. And one of the things, I'm not a big lover of statistics, but one of the things that came from it, I used to do it avidly for the first few years. I used to publish an annual report. I don't do that now because simply I've got too busy doing other things. But one of the things that was borne out, and I suspect it's still broadly the same, is that something like 65 to 70% of all the police cases I had and they were in two classes, one on duty and then another category of off duty. So I had the different categories because if you're a police officer and you see something in your garden, well, you're still the same police officer. You're just not doing it in an official capacity, but you're witnessing it and you are a trained observer. And on how to report and write down incidents as they develop. So the on-duty sightings, the statistic that I always found most interesting was about 65 to 70% of the cases of the on-duty cases were all multiple officer corroboration cases. So we're talking, you know, anywhere from one case, 24 officers over several counties in one incident, the largest one on the database. So 70% literally, it's me and a colleague in a police car, parked up somewhere, witnessed something together. That kind of thing, or 4 or 5 officers called to an incident where a member which reported something in the sky, and they turn up. The first police car turns up and goes, "Yeah, I can see something," and then another police car turns up, and the crew of that go, "Yeah, I see that too." So that's often what you've got. So suffice to say that my second book will be about my police cases, which hopefully will be finished by the end of this year. It should have been written about 6 years ago because I began it and then got sidetracked with my work on Rendlesham Forest, which perhaps we'll talk about in due course. But suffice to say that when I created the database, that attracted a lot of media attention, something that I kind of anticipated, but I didn't see the spin-off. And the spin-off was within a couple of months, UFO groups from around the UK began to contact me and say, "Well, can you give us a lecture about some of your police cases? And, you know, we'll put you up in a hotel, we'll pay your travel expenses, kind of thing." And I kind of never envisaged that to be the case. I'd not thought that through. But fortunately, I soon found that public speaking came very easily to me, which was a surprise because many of my colleagues, you know, in the police, if you went near a TV camera or a radio, you know, asked to give a comment for the radio, local radio, they would run a mile. But for me, it's like water, as we say in England, water off a duck's back. It came very easily to me, and I really enjoyed public speaking. So you know, 2 months earlier, I'd never done any public speaking. 2 months later, you know, talking in front of 150, 200 people in a crowded room. So fortunately, that came easy to me, and so that's what I did. And there was a downside to doing my police work in my detective's role, and also as a hobby researching UK police officers cases. And the downside was that I obviously had to tell my bosses that I created this database, and I did all that, and I did everything I was supposed to do, and I was allowed to do it. You just had to notify your own force. But suffice to say that as I became more popular in the public domain, and more known in the public domain through TV and radio appearances, I was basically started to have sanctions put on me, little things at first, and then more and more things that I wasn't allowed to do. I wasn't allowed to say where I was based. I wasn't allowed to say which force I belonged to. I wasn't allowed to give my badge number. You know, those kind of things all started to come in. And life became uncomfortable at one point. And at one point, I was disciplined simply for writing to the Ministry of Defence in a private capacity, which I made absolutely clear in a letter to the Ministry of Defence, and that was 2009. And what had happened to prompt that was the Ministry of Defence had operated a a UFO desk for for well over 50 years. So basically, if you're a member of the public, you rang the police, or if you live near the military base, you rang the military base. They would then fill in a form on your behalf, and in the old days, send telexes to London, where they would go through this what's called the UFO desk, and basically they'd be looked at and basically filed, because most were very poorly filled in, and it very much depended on the attitude of the person filling in the form on your behalf. And basically, most just were filed, routinely filed, because it was just a member of the public and poorly scant details. Well, that was the only source of interaction with the government through the Ministry of Defence that people really had on UFO statistics, how many sightings had been per year. Well, suddenly in 2009, the MOD said we're closing the UFO reporting desk as a cost-cutting exercise, because we're going to save £55,000, which was the salary for one person office, of that particular office, and so that shows you how serious this was, a one-person office, and literally there's never been any case that's been of any defence significance, as they termed it, and so they closed it. Well, from my point of view, I knew whilst that was rubbish what they were talking, the MOD has always talked rubbish, and they've always played down, and they've always followed America's lead until recently. They always followed America's lead, and basically the it made me think, well, the fact that you're closing the MOD desk doesn't mean that police forces are not going to get members of the public ringing up and saying, I've just seen something in the sky. And so what I decided to do was write to all the chief constables. Now, in the UK, it's not one national police force. They're broken down into regional, what we call counties, like Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and that's such a big county. It's West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, Essex, Sussex, broad geographical areas. And there were 43 police forces in the UK, Scotland, and Wales. And so I wrote a draft letter and posted it off to all of them. And as a matter of courtesy, and I was doing this in an off-duty capacity, I made it clear to the chief constables of the forces that I was writing to that it was an off-duty capacity, and that I had an unofficial police database, blah, blah, blah. I didn't hide anything. And I basically wrote to, I think it turned out to be 38 or 39 forces, including my own. And we'd got a new chief constable at the time. And well, I remember I was just about to go on a course. I think it was a CID refresher. You had to do it every now and again. And I was about to travel there to London, I think it was. It was in the house. And I worked in Leeds. So I remember going to set off one afternoon at work. So it was probably a Monday morning or something like that. And I remember getting a message saying, can you go see the chief superintendent? And I thought, well, okay. Didn't really have any alarm bells. And I got in, and I'll talk about this in the book in detail because I think it's interesting. But suffice to say that the chief superintendent had received a phone call from my chief constable, my new chief constable, and I'll disclose who it is and everybody in the book. And it turns out that my new chief constable had received a phone call from another experienced chief constable of a different force. And the basic tone of the conversation was, who is this UFO nut you've got working for you? And my chief superintendent, my chief constable, rather than just saying, well, he just does it in his private capacity, he clearly had a dim view of UFOs. And so he'd instructed my chief superintendent, my area commander, to discipline me through the police disciplinary procedures, which is very serious. And of could potentially cost you your career. Now, the irony is I could have understood if I'd have chained myself naked to some metal railings outside the police station and said, on me, you know, UFOs are real. I made an absolute fool of myself, but I didn't. I'd written a professional letter in an off-duty capacity, just saying, well, you know, will you send the sightings that you still will get to me? And the irony was that two forces within a week had written back to me and said, yeah, we'll make you our single point of contact and we'll send you our cases so you can investigate. And I thought, I've made it. This is going to be right. But obviously that all stopped when I was then disciplined, which then took over a year, blah, blah, blah. And suffice to say, you can't beat a big organization. And they said, oh, I didn't have permission to write the letter, blah, blah, blah. It'll all be explained in the book, but suffice to say that that was one of the reasons why ultimately I decided to retire early from the police after nearly 24 years. And I then left to create UFO Truth magazine, which is a bi-monthly e-zine, which features articles by many of the top people in the world. It's every 2 months. It comes in a PDF format and it's just sent direct to your email. So you can look that up. Now, I notice in the chat box, somebody said talk about Rendlesham Forest. So, okay, let's get talking about Rendlesham Forest. Obviously, I'd become aware through reading books, etc., about the Rendlesham Forest case, which occurred in Suffolk in late December 1980. And like many others, there seemed to be multiple witnesses, and it was very strange. It happened on several consecutive nights. And so I kind of watched and read pretty much everything that had come about Rendlesham Forest. Well, going back to the police side, because that's how I get involved in Rendlesham Forest, is the UFO Hunters program with Bill Burns that ran for, I think, 3 series. They contacted me and said, look, we want to interview you about your police database. And I thought, oh, that's great. That's really good publicity, should attract some police officers, etc. And as luck would have it, when it got closer to the filming schedules, and they were bringing over a film crew from the States, I just said, well, you know, are you coming over to the UK? Are you coming to just film me? Or you must be coming to do some other type work as well. And they said, yeah, we're going to do an episode about Rendlesham Forest. And I said, oh, that's really interesting because I'm really interested in Rendlesham Forest. And they said, why? And I said, well, Rendlesham Forest is a really famous case, and it involves, I believe, nuclear weapons, beams being shone down into what was called a nuclear weapons storage area, and which is one of the main evidential areas that always been, you know, kind of disputed. Now, the reason why I brought it up was when I served in the Royal Air Force Police, I, for 6 years, 3 of my 6 years, was working on 2 nuclear bases, protecting tactical nuclear weapons housed in weapon storage areas on air bases, airfields. And I'd been at RAF Honington in Suffolk, which is obviously not too many miles away from Rendlesham Forest, also in Suffolk. And I'd also worked on RAF Larbrook, which was in Holland, near to the, well, in Germany, near to the Dutch border. It was about 11 miles from the Dutch border, near a town called Venlo. And I'd spent 18 months doing that. And so I had a unique perspective in the sense that I did pretty much exactly the same job as what the people involved, which were mainly US Air Force security police officers, basically the equivalent of an RAF police officer, and they guarded tactical nuclear weapons at RAF Bentwaters and obviously protected the twin bases of RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters, which is about 80 miles north east of London geographically. And I said to the producers, well, I've got some questions for Colonel Holt, who was the then deputy base commander, who'd written this very famous memorandum that's been that now is referred to as the Holt Memorandum, which is arguably one of the top 5 or 10 UFO documents in history, because it was signed by him, then a deputy base commander of what was a nuclear base. And not many people do that at that rank. And he also said in that one-page memo that 2 days earlier there'd been a landed craft, a small triangular craft had been found in the forest and been seen by some security police officers. And then a couple of nights later, he said he then went out with a small team into the forest and they had multiple UFO encounters themselves. So basically, I said, well, I think there's more witnesses. And they said, why? And I said, well, because there is a high watchtower in the weapons storage area at RF Bentwaters, and all the trees are kept down to about 40 feet, and that's at 80 feet. So they would have had a 360, and I'm sure that if there had been UFOs shining a beam down, which was an alleged story of a beam being sent down into the nuclear bunkers, I knew that there were security police officers walking around inside of that inner perimeter of this very secure facility, and that they would have seen it too, inevitably. And yet nobody knew of these witnesses. Well, suffice to say that they said, oh, we like that story. Yeah, come down. And cutting a long story short, in December of 2007, I met Colonel Holt for the first time. He retired as a full-blood colonel. And initially we got on really, really well. And I remember at the end of our first night of meeting, I'd said, look, you know, I've always thought that this story is so good, and I love films with passion. You know, I think it's destined to become a film, a feature film at some point. And I said, would you collaborate with me on it? I'll write it and then I'll send it to you. You can give me any pointers, etc., and collaborate with me on it. And he went, yeah, okay. Wow. I thought, this is going to be really good. And for the next 7 years, roughly 7 years, we had a collaboration working on that script, which was written and was shown to some key people in the film world. But ultimately, the big problem film-wise, I'll digress slightly, is the fact that Rendlesham does not have a Harrison Ford hero figure. It's complicated. There are multiple shifts involved, multiple personnel involved in different shifts who see different things on different days. And it's an ensemble piece. I still think it will work, but ultimately, I think Hollywood doesn't tell the story for that very reason. But I think it could be done through the perspective of 2 or 3 people. But anyway, suffice to say, that happened. I met Holt. We got on really well. We had this 7 years collaboration. So there's my basic interest in the case. Now I became actively involved and said, look, you know, from this point on, I'll be researching Rendlesham. Ended up doing lots of documentaries and things like that. Suffice to say that that collaboration period ended. It wasn't a definite end date. It wasn't like that. It wasn't a massive falling out, but it was a realization on my part that that Colonel Holt knew a lot more about other things, other events that he wasn't telling anyone about, and so therefore I ended that relationship because he was saying things about witnesses that I didn't think was right, and they were uncorroborated. And I said, fine, if you've got the information, put it out there. But he never did. He just repeated the same old stories without providing any corroboration of actual facts. It was always, oh, well, a friend told me, and a friend told me, and oh, I've talked to a certain person. And I kind of saw through that. And with I was an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses. It just didn't feel right. So when that started to happen, I said, you know, that's not for me. So I ended that. And so we're not on good terms now, which is a shame, but there you go. And suffice to say that in 2017, I was approached by a someone who wanted to make a documentary and about Rendlesham Forest, and I said basically okay, and they wanted me to be the lead researcher. Well, I'd never been the lead researcher on anything, and I said, well, if I'm going to be the lead researcher, and at one time was also the co-editor and writer or co-writer, I need to be absolutely accurate about what I'm going to do. So it basically led me to a decision to do a complete re-investigation of the Rendlesham Forest case. And so that's what I did. And cutting a long story short, that re-investigation lasted about 5.5 years. I then realized that I got so much material by re-interviewing many of the witnesses, finding a lot of old interviews that people had never read about, that were in obscure little UFO publications that involved some of the key people in the case. And I'd also established some new interviews that were really evidential. That I realized that there was too much material just for the documentary. So basically, I'm going to write a book. I'd done all the research. I was giving it for the film, for them to interview, but I'd already done the interviews. So I produced material that gave to the film the majority of the time, and basically I had the idea to write a book. So I ended up writing this book, which is 500 pages, non-human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO incidents. It's an important distinction because at the conclusion of my 5.5 years of research, I break it down into at least 17 different incidents over collectively a 6 or 7 day period, because there was a new incident that had come to light through my research of something happening on the 23rd of December, which was before the accepted first night, which was generally regarded as the night of the 25th of December into the 26th. Lots of new information there, lots of old interviews. And what I did, that was my first book. So despite writing a lot as a magazine editor and doing articles, that was my first book. And I decided that I was just going to concentrate on the facts, take personalities out of it, and just use my, I guess, analytical skills as a former detective to review all the material, all the new material. And people who've read the book, was Don Schmidt, obviously famous for his Roswell research. He wrote the foreword, and he basically said it's a forensic Sherlock Holmes kind of evaluation of everything. I see in the chat room somebody says binary codes. Contentious. I talk about it in the book. Personally, I think that there was a lot of red flags for me about the binary code, because Jim Penniston, one of the principal witnesses, who was clearly a witness to what was regarded as the first night small black triangle in the forest incident, he didn't tell anybody it for many years. He tells a convoluted story about, who was he going to tell? Lots of red flags. So people going about, the binary code and 7 geographical locations around the earth. Personally, I'm very suspicious of that. I'm not saying it can't happen. I download information, I think it can. But I go into it in the book. There are circumstances that lead me to think that he was very inconsistent about how that story broke and how many pages of binary there were. The fact that it's a ring bind, that you could take pages out, put pages in. The fact that Colonel Holt read through the book on several occasions, never seen any pages of binary code in it. That kind of thing kind of throws up some questions. So it may have happened, but it's a totally standalone. There's no corroboration for the binary codes whatsoever. So just notice that in the chat room. All right, so that's that. Let's talk about now things happening at the same time, and that's where I'm juggling a lot of things. As we come to the first lockdown, 2020 in the UK, I'm working on the book. but I'm also had been involved in a process of putting an international organisation, a non-government agency, called an NGO, international NGO called ICER, the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. Well, basically, I'd been approached in 2018 by Don Smith, ironically, and with an invite to go to Moscow, somewhere I was really excited to go because child of the Cold War, it was a place you could never get to, and I absolutely loved Moscow. It was a beautiful city. But suffice to say that I and several other people, including Don Smith, Bertol Panotti, Ajay Javad from Brazil, various other people, met in Moscow to meet with an unofficial Chinese group, not government, allegedly not government, and they wanted to create an international coalition of countries to promote kind of disclosure. Cutting a long story short, that didn't happen because things happened in China that stopped it happening. They didn't deliver on their initial promises. And the strange thing about lockdown, and you can again call it fortuitous, is basically the people started to use Zoom to stay in touch with relatives, and I was no different. And I basically took out a professional Zoom account and started contacting all the people and said, look, we shouldn't let this idea go of this coalition, and let's see how many countries we can get together. We'd already identified 14 and 15, and cutting a long story short, over a year, 18 months in preparation before we launched publicly in May of 2021. We started off with something like 25, 26 countries when we launched, and now we're up to 30 countries, and I think that within the next 6 months we'll probably be up to 30, 32 countries, which emphasizes the global aspect. And I'm sure that Jim and Danny Sheehan and people like that are very interested in the fact that ICER is made up of scientists, academics, leading UFO, UAP researchers, and we've got representatives at the moment in 30 countries. This is where I talk about the fact that ICER is global, and there aren't really any organizations out there other than the United Nations, which really isn't doing anything on UFOs. But as we move closer to this paradigm shift of where there is an acknowledgement that we're dealing with something that's non-human, whether it's ET, interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, whatever, it's something non-human. As we approach that time, there will be a level of shock for the public. And how do you try to reduce that shock? Well, ICER, our byline is preparing for contact. And what we mean by that is preparing for this acknowledgement that we're dealing with a non-human intelligence. And we think in terms of ICER, and I'm the vice president now, is that we do it through education, and which ties in a lot with what Jim does with his work with Humanitarian Rising and Ubiquity University and the New Paradigm Institute with Danny Sheehan. It's all basically the same idea that basically we have to start educating the people because they're in for a shock. And if you don't start educating the people soon, then the shock will be even worse. And some people, perhaps 20, 30%, will suffer psychologically, much in the same way that the 2 lockdowns in the UK produced a hell of a lot of mental health issues because nobody had ever been denied their movements. And a lot of people suffered mental health wise. And I think a proportion of the public, if they're not prepared through education, will suffer through this ontological shock of being told that actually we've lied to you for 70 years and they are real of some kind. So that's kind of where we are at now. More recently, just in the last couple of months, I'm also launched another venture, which is called UK Pilots Reporting UAP. And that's because in Britain, there are no civil aviation guidelines that specifically mention UAP. It's not even mentioned, recognized as a term. The UK government is not following America's lead on the UAP since 2017 with the New York Times that began this re-emergence of the subject. It's very odd why that is. Uh, Clearly, pilots in the UK are seeing things, and there's lots of cases on the new website, which I've created called UK Pilots Reporting UAP.co.uk. There's lots of cases say that it is happening, and there needs to be an air safety discussion, much in the same way that Ryan Graves created Americans for Safe Aerospace and has now taken it much, much further with co-sponsored legislation that's set to go before Congress to be voted on to see if that becomes part of the FAA in the US. And it's all to do with how we report these procedures in UAP, and there has to be really a standardized reporting procedure across all countries. What's the point in having 100 countries having 100 different systems? If we're really going to start this properly, we should all be adopting whatever's in the procedures that are agreed upon in the United States. And I shall look to speak to Ryan on that and say, look, we should adopt very similar for the UK and any other country. We should all be standardized, because we have to start realizing, and I'll shut up in a minute for Jim because I know he's dying to get in there, is that we now need to start thinking not as countries. We have to start thinking of how do we deal with this phenomena, this acceptance of a non-human intelligence on a global scale. And that's where ICER comes in, and that's where education comes in. And we really need to start doing that, because there is just one human race. We're not countries anymore. It does bind us together. We come together as the human race. And I'll hand you back now to Jim, as you've let me just carry on there for an hour and quarter.
Thank you, Gary. That was a great story. It's and it's so interesting, the subtleties of how an individual life is led
Absolutely.
by just a series of small events that turn out, when you look back over your shoulder over time, to be a guidance of synchronicities that
Absolutely.
have led you on your way. And here you are, vice president of the International Coalition of Extraterrestrial Studies. You're putting together the UFO Pilots Association in the UK, and one of the great, the leaders of the disclosure movement globally. So thank you for your decades of service. It's been quite impressive to just sit here listening to your story.
When I hear it, when I go back, and when people introduce me and you look back and you think, is that me that they're talking about? This is a very, very weird story from a little guy from a working class family in Scunthorpe. And never, ever could I envisage being an international lecturer, 22 countries now, and being involved at the sharp end of trying to promote this subject and trying to make a little change to what is
Yeah,
going to, it is going to come. And I really see that this is the most exciting time in my life in the subject. And like you, I think we've been around for so long, from the age of, I'm now 63, coming up to 64. My sighting was when I was 16. So decades of following the subject, but never are we closer to a major breakthrough than we are now.
yeah,
So we've got
exactly.
to hang in there.
Exactly.
And the genie is out the bottle, and you can't put that genie back in,
Exactly.
even
Exactly.
though the likes of Sean Kirkpatrick and our historical report would like you to do. It's not going to work this time. We now live in a different world of social media, that things can respond. If there's a sighting tomorrow, like Phoenix Lights, and I've been saying this for a while now, that we're into catastrophic disclosure if it happens tomorrow, because everybody will be live streaming, 8K cameras, and you are straight
Exactly.
to reality.
Exactly.
And that's a big shock that we shouldn't have to make, that the
Yeah.
government shouldn't let us make.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I think that the public is much wiser and more open to the ET phenomenon than our governments think.
Yeah,
Because it's been ordinary people like you that have had these experiences, and in poll after poll, a clear majority, 2/3 of the people not only believe that it's all true, but believe that the governments are covering it up. So I think when this disclosure happens, controlled or catastrophic by whatever means, I think there will be more of a public receptivity than we might imagine.
Yeah, I think the world's a very different place now, and I think, you know, in the 1950s, when really the Robertson panel in '53 came in and created the debunking program, there was really, once you got the media on board at high level, then they could literally control the narrative. Whereas now, I think with social media, you cannot control the narrative. And like I say, if there's a Phoenix Lights, everybody's going to be live streaming it, and there's going to be 8K cameras, and they're not going to be able to say it's flares like they
Yeah.
just about got away with in 1997. So we're on the brink, and all the pilots that come from, you know, what's really impressed me just in the last 3 months, the emergence of Tim Galladay, the Rear Admiral. What a star that guy is. He is, Tim Galladay. He's so happy, matter of fact, in saying, look, no, it's time we dealt with this. We are dealing with something non-human. And he talks about it so matter of factly. And somebody of his rank is, you'd never have got that a few years ago. So he is a
No, no.
huge bonus. Gary Nolan, what a fantastic promoter for the subject. Somebody who's Nobel nominated, and basically he's saying absolutely 100%. A few months ago, 100% we're dealing with something non-human. When you've got the caliber of these people coming out, David Grush coming forward, somebody with his intel and military background, absolutely second to none, and yet it's still the media who are still very complicit in trying to do this down, and hence the Arrow report, limited coverage to certain writers that will put a downer on it. But the public are not going to fall for it this time. Yes, there'll be a few negative stories in the national press, but it won't last long because there's too many good people coming out who are influential.
Exactly.
And we will break this. We will break this.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll bring our conversation to a close right there so we can get into the after chat. But I really want to thank you, Gary, for your courage and your leadership in this domain, because your leadership and courage took place when the governments were uh, scrupulously covering everything up and making it seem that if you even talked about UFOs, you were crazy. And you were one of the pioneers. And so you're responsible for the breakthrough, along with many, many others.
We're not
Uh,
there yet. We're close. We're
yeah,
close.
yeah, yeah. But we're as
And
Richard Dolan says, the toothpaste is out of the tube.
absolutely. And the point is, all of us, what you're doing, what Dan is doing, what I'm doing,
Yeah,
what other people
yeah,
are
yeah,
doing,
yeah.
we're just small little cogs. But if collectively we come
Exactly,
together and work for the same cause,
exactly.
and do what we didn't do for a long time, we never organized very well historically, ufology.
Yeah,
And we must cooperate better than we did. So we're a more powerful force. And I think if we do that, we will get it over the line. We're close.
yeah. Well, thank you, Gary, and thank you, everyone. If you'd like to join the after chat, Gary has a few minutes, and we will talk further there. You can see the link in the chat box. You receive the link in your Zoom reminder for today. And then tomorrow we will continue our conversation around the extraterrestrial dimension. And so thank you, everyone.
Thank
See you in
you.
the after chat. Bye for now.
Can I just click on this link now?
Yeah, you click on the link and then you go right in.
Okay, I'm clicking
All
on
right.